Our third presentation is going to be an online presentation. Our speaker is Nicholas Al-Jeloo, an independent scholar and researcher based at Ankara in Erbil, Iraq. Nicholas has a PhD in Syriac Studies and a BA in Semitic Languages from Sydney University, as well as an MA in Syriac Christianity from Leiden University. Nicholas has taught classical Syriac at Sydney University and the University of Melbourne, as well as English at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. He has published a number of articles and book chapters in relation to Syriac and Assyrian studies, and is currently the English language editor of Banipal, the quarterly publication of the General Directorate for Syriac Culture and Arts in the northern region of Iraq. Nicholas's title today is An Expelled and Unwanted Minority, the Assyrians of Hakkâri. Thank you, Nicholas, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. The floor is yours.
Firstly, I'd just like to say how much of a pleasure it is to be with you all at this very interesting conference, even though it's online. And I wish the organizers the best of success for the rest of the conference. Now, currently, a significant Christian Assyrian minority numbering about 30,000 continues to reside in Turkey. The majority of them adhere to the Syriac Orthodox Church, with a minority of Chaldean and Syriac Catholics, as well as some Protestants. Now, most of these originate from Mardin, but now live in Istanbul. In many other provinces, autochthonous Assyrians retain villages, active churches, and monasteries, as well as community foundations and associations, despite dwindling numbers. Now, many indigenous Assyrians, however, were expelled from certain parts of the country during the early years of the Republican period, and their descendants today do not have the legal right to return to their homes. The bulk of this expelled population, especially from Van and Hakkâri, comprises those adhering to the Church of the East, which is the only Syriac church that has never been officially recognized or held any official status within the country since its establishment as a republic in 1923. Now, the Hakkâri Assyrians were indigenous to the area encompassing the formerly Kurdish-ruled emirate of the same name, which used to include neighboring parts of modern-day Şırnak and Van provinces. Now, the evidence for this is in the many Akkadian and Aramaic place names which local Kurds still use, despite them being changed to Turkish ones after 1940. Moreover, the Assyrians attribute their Christian conversion to the religion's early spread and maintained many churches which had been founded in the 4th and 5th centuries. Now, the majority of them adhered to the Church of the East, which flourished in the Persian Empire, outside the borders of the Roman Empire, and maintained its center at Baghdad until 1268. Now, it declared its independence from the rest of Christianity in 424, 7 years prior to the controversial Council of Ephesus, which saw the excommunication of Nestorius, who was then Bishop of Constantinople.
Beyefendi koptu ama geri gelebileceğini söylemişti. İsterseniz bekleyin.
Our panelist has a connectivity problem. We might wait a little to see if he will be joining us again.
But I think Nicholas is going to be back.
Geri döneceğini söylemişti. Böyle bir
Our panelists actually warned us ahead of time that there might be some connectivity issues as he's joining us from Iraq.
Okay. I apologize. I live in Iraq and we have frequent power outages. So that was one of the power outages. Okay. So, now the Council of Constantinople at the time, as well as those who agreed with his Christology. So, having originally been tied to the Patriarchate of Antioch, the school of which Nestorius had been educated in, the Church of the East upheld these teachings and stood with him. And this led to its stigmatization by the rest of the Christian world, which subsequently deemed it to be heretical, labeling it with the pejorative term Nestorian, a name which the Church of the East itself has always rejected. Nevertheless, this term, Nasturi, was used by Ottoman authorities to define the church as a religious community, and it has persisted well after the foundation of the Turkish Republic. Now, by the late 19th century, due to the conversion of many of its adherents in other areas to Catholicism in the form of the Chaldean Uniate Church, the Church of the East's remnants became limited to the Hakkâri and Botan regions of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Urmia plain in Iran. Now, the traditionalist Hakkâri Assyrians had gradually assumed a new importance from the 17th century onward, with the establishment of new dioceses in the area, culminating in the removal of the Patriarchate to Koçanis by 1685. Now, prior to 1915, the Hakkâri Sanjak held the world's largest concentration of ethnic Assyrians, who numbered over 100,000 and inhabited more than 280 villages. They formed about half of Hakkâri's population, consisting an absolute majority in 2/3 of the province. They were divided into two classes, the Ashirets, who comprised 5 large tribes that paid a nominal tribute to the Ottoman state and largely conducted their own affairs in an autonomous manner, including self-defense, and the Rayats, who were Ottoman subjects that paid taxes to local government representatives and were expected to serve in the army. In Ottoman times, the Ashiret area had been known as Nasturi Arazisi, or the Nestorian territories, and was semi-independent. The Koçanis Patriarchate actually only first made contact with the Ottoman authorities in 1846. So, before the First World War, Hakkâri Assyrians had shown no enmity toward the Ottoman authorities, especially following a meeting which took place in Van on the 3rd of August 1914 between Patriarch Marshimon Binyamin and Governor Hassan Tahsin Bey, who made a number of promises to keep the Assyrians loyal. However, from August onward, Assyrians in the frontier district of Şemdinli began to flee attacks by Ottoman military units to the Urmia plain, and wholesale massacres of Assyrians by Ottoman troops were also being reported in Yüksekova, Başkale, and Saray. Despite Assyrian attempts to remain loyal to their overlords, the situation worsened, and by November 23rd, the Patriarch was forced to inquire from the Russian vice-consul in Tabriz whether or not to commence hostilities against these unwarranted attacks. After the Ottoman defeat at Sarıkamış on the 1st of January 1915, their forces invaded and occupied the Urmia and Salmas plains in Iran. More than 10,000 Assyrians died, either fleeing to Russia from disease at the American and French missions in Urmia or during raids on villages. On February 23rd, the Church of the East's bishop in Urmia, Mardincha, originally from Şemdinli, was shot dead by Ottoman troops with 42 other prominent Assyrians. In April, so this is just some pictures of Urmia. Now, in April, after a new round of massacres in Yüksekova and Başkale districts, the Patriarch convened an assembly with Hakkâri's Assyrian chieftains and lay leaders resulting in an order for general mobilization against the apparent threat. So that June, the Patriarch left for Tabriz to meet with the Russians, requesting military aid and protection. This was taken by the Ottomans as a betrayal and declaration of war, and they began attacking the Assyrians on all sides from June 23rd. 2 weeks later, the Patriarch returned from Tabriz bearing the news that the Russians would be unable to provide direct assistance. After the last tribal district capitulated on September 15, the Assyrians had no other hope but to flee to Iran, where they could be protected. The Patriarch personally led the survivors on their trek. By October 5th, as many as 50,000 Assyrian refugees had arrived on the Salmas plain, where many of them died of starvation and disease. They were subsequently distributed among villages in the Salmas, Urmia, and Khoy districts for temporary resettlement, receiving protection and arms from the Russians who had occupied the area. Now, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Russians withdrew from Urmia. On the 16th, just some more pictures from Urmia. On the 16th of March 1918, the Patriarch, Marshamun, was murdered by Ismail Agha, also known as Simkyo, leader of the Kurdish Shikak tribe, who had pretended to be interested in an alliance with the Assyrians. That summer, Ottoman troops advanced on Urmia, breaking through the Assyrian lines of defense. So on the 31st of July, the whole Christian population in the region, numbering as many as 80,000, and including the surviving refugees from Hakkâri, began a long exodus toward Hamadan. Almost all 16,000 who remained were exterminated. And after more than a month, the 50,000 Christians who survived the exodus were sheltered by the British in a refugee camp at Baquba near Baghdad. Less than 20,000 of these were Hakkâri Assyrians, of which an additional 10 to 15,000 had found shelter in what later became the Soviet Union. So in 1920, the refugees were moved to another camp at Mandan near Mosul, which was then closed in May 1921. The remaining Hakkâri Assyrians were to be resettled in the north of Mosul province. And you can see some of those areas where they were to be resettled. However, instead of settling in northern Iraq, some 8,000 of them belonging to the Tiare and Truma tribes decided to return to their native villages, which they had been forced to abandon 6 years earlier, hoping to resume living as they had been before the war. Now, due to the area being a political no man's land, and because of the Assyrians' independent tribal nature, the returnee men were naturally armed in order to defend themselves, in the absence of police or an army to protect them. Moreover, because the Allies had won the war, they had assumed that Hakkâri had been incorporated into British-controlled Iraq and was no longer under Turkish rule. At the Lausanne Conference in 1923, some Assyrians met with Turkish representatives, stating that their armed units in Mosul were ready to leave British control and come under the command of Turkish authorities in order to serve Turkey's right to sovereignty in Mosul in exchange for autonomy in the Hakkâri province. This idea was not seriously entertained. In May and June 1924, Turkey and Britain negotiated the Mosul issue at the Golden Horn Conference. British representative Sir Percy Cox wanted Hakkâri to be returned to the Assyrians and incorporated into the Kingdom of Iraq, while Turkish representative Fethi Bey rejected the entire plan, citing that the Assyrians were a minority and arguing that despite the armed uprisings they had caused in the region, they could just as well get their old privileges back within Turkey's borders. These negotiations failed, and both parties decided to appeal to the League of Nations. On the other hand, the Turkish government had already begun efforts to organize the local Kurdish tribes, while collecting the Assyrians' weapons so they wouldn't be able to defend themselves, under the pretense of preventing a British-led rebellion. That July, Hakkâri governor Halil Rifat Bey was passing from Çölemrik to Çukurca to inspect the region's tribes, in accordance with a government order. He had written to Evliya Bey, Kurdish Agha of Çal and Çukurca district administrator, telling him to inform the Assyrians not to worry about his visit. He wanted to discuss whether they had returned under British orders, in which case they would need to return to Iraq, or they wanted to live in Turkey as citizens, in which case they would be free to do so. Evliya Bey, however, informed the Assyrians of Tkhuma that the Turks were planning to expel them by force and to annihilate them. When the Assyrians under Malik Gilyana met the governor on the 7th of August, they began shooting at the Turkish convoy. The governor and 5 soldiers were injured and taken prisoner, while a gendarmerie battalion commander and 3 privates were killed. The Assyrians intended to take the prisoners to the British at Ahmadiyya, but released them after Malik Khoshaba of Lower Tiare intervened, expressing his disappointment that they had been tricked by Kurds into attacking the Turks. After learning of these events, the Turkish government labeled the incident a rebellion and decided to use force to expel the unwanted Assyrian returnees. On August 14, they placed the operation under the command of Jafer Tayyar Pasha. Turkish forces also benefited from Kurdish tribes, forming small detachments from local volunteers. Any armed Assyrians detected were to be pursued and destroyed. In total, the force gathered against them numbered over 40,000. The Turks even established contact with Simko, who had murdered the Assyrian patriarch 6 years earlier. The operation began on September 11, a very ominous date. The Assyrians were in a difficult situation and could not put up a serious resistance, since their population was limited and the majority of their fighting men were in military service with the British in Iraq. In order to protect the embattled Assyrians, British planes attacked Turkish troops from the air. Armed Assyrians dispersed, and unarmed civilians abandoned their villages, fleeing to the mountains. The British ordered the Assyrians to return to Iraq and not to cross the border again. The operation was effectively terminated on October the 2nd. Because of his help in securing the governor's release, Malik Khoshaba was permitted to remain in Turkey with 200 of his people. However, because his tribe alone numbered over 2,000 people, he refused and politely left for Iraq. Only one Assyrian family remained in Hakkari's Çukurca district until 1935, when they also left for Iraq. In Ataturk's opening speech to the Turkish Grand National Assembly that November, he referred to serious crimes committed by some Nestorian bandits requiring special measures. This act of ethnic cleansing is recorded in official Turkish history as the Nestorian Revolt and considered the first uprising against the Republic, even though it all came from a total misunderstanding. Now, that October, the League of Nations met in Brussels to discuss the disputed border between Turkey and Iraq, naming the provisional border the Brussels line. The Council appointed 2 consecutive commissions to investigate the situation on the ground. The second commission's final report stated that Turkish soldiers occupied villages and carried out forced deportations en masse of Hakkari's last Assyrians, during which they fell ill or were abandoned or died of starvation and cold. It blamed the soldiers for imposing very heavy punishments and carrying out acts of violence, going as far as massacre, with Kurds being used to kill Christian Assyrians. The Brussels line was taken as the border between Iraq and Turkey, and Mosul became part of Iraq. It was also stated that Turkey should not be punished with losing Hakkari, and that the Assyrians, to some extent, only had themselves to blame for their expulsion, and despite the broad rights that they enjoyed under the Ottomans, their demands to separate from Turkey were unjustified. I quote, At the start of the Great War, the Assyrian people has revolted against its legal government without reason or provocation. We know this is nonsense, but incited by forces from outside. End quote. Turkish sovereignty over Hakkâri was accepted without question. On 5th of June 1926, Britain, Iraq, and Turkey entered into the Ankara Treaty. Turkey officially agreed to the Brussels line as its border with Iraq, and a permanent frontier commission was established. In their meetings, the Turkish delegation often complained about the Assyrians committing border violations, demanding that they be removed from the border region completely for allegedly disturbing the peace. On the other hand, the Iraqis requested Turkey to allow Assyrian shepherds to pass through its border to graze their flocks, but Turkey rejected this on the grounds that they disrupted peace and order. Shepherds disrupting peace and order. By September 1927, the entire frontier had been demarcated on the ground, and the Hakkâri Assyrians were involuntarily locked out of their homeland by agreements in which they had no say. They didn't even have the right to become Turkish citizens. Between 1935 and 1990, the only Assyrians remaining in Hakkâri lived in two remote villages of Beytüşebab district, or three, I should say. Elsewhere, the Assyrians who remained were those who had been Islamized or assimilated into the local Kurdish population. The Assyrians of the village of Hassana in Şırnak's Silopi district were subsequently forced to join other Christian denominations because they could no longer maintain communication with their patriarchate in Iraq. The Nestorian Church, as Turkish authorities continued to call it, had no legal status in the new republic. It had been demonized for supposedly declaring war on the Ottoman Empire in 1915 and was thereafter perceived as a tool being used for British imperialist ambitions in the Middle East. The state confiscated properties, churches, and monasteries, and some of them were even sold to private local buyers. It was not until after the First Gulf War in 1991, when many of the church's adherents from Iraq fled to Turkey as refugees, that it again regained a presence in the country, albeit a transient one. There are still a few thousand Assyrian refugees belonging to the Church of the East in major Turkish cities, however, none of them in their native Hakkâri. As for the Assyrians expelled in 1915 and 1924, they have strongly maintained their tribal and village identities and still celebrate the feast days of the churches that they were forced to abandon. Hakkâri is still a major part of their psyche and remains a major feature of their songs and folk tales. They still cook foods that their ancestors ate in Hakkâri, dance the same dances, and maintain the same folk dress which they wear on special occasions. Even when they were resettled in Iraq and later Syria, they continued to organize and group themselves around the tribes and villages that they belonged to back in Hakkâri, with many of them settling near the Turkish border in the hope of one day being able to return to their former homes. Psychologically, it is as if they never left, and this is an indication of how ingrained the area is still in their minds, being its native inhabitants after all. Most dream of one day being able to return to visit where their ancestors lived for centuries, if not millennia, and many have. But the majority are still traumatized by the events that led to their expulsion and are apprehensive of how they would be received by the Kurdish locals as well as by Turkish authorities. They have also faced the problem of not knowing exactly where the villages they originate from are located now, since the names have been changed, and they also dread finding their churches and cemeteries desecrated, which is a sad fact in many cases. So without, this is my last paragraph, by the way, it's my conclusion. Without a valid official presence in Turkey, the Church of the East has been unable to do much in the way of legally contesting the current state of its former properties and historical cultural patrimony, or working on an international agreement for their preservation. While a handful of Turkish citizens still identify as adherents of this church, there aren't enough for a viable congregation because they are scattered, and many of them live between Turkey and the diaspora. In light of this, more established sister churches have offered to step in to act as guarantors of these properties or to manage them under their own religious community foundations. The main issue, though, remains one of ownership. Most of the religious sites previously belonging to the church are now registered as private or government properties. This is the main stumbling block which needs to be overcome if it actually wants to own the structures and their adjacent properties again, rather than just having them restored. Otherwise, the religious buildings can be restored while remaining in government or private hands, just in order for them to be protected, preserved, and opened for tourism. Personally, I wish that there could be a law of return for the Assyrians of Hakkâri, but I guess that's a long way away. Thank you for providing me with the opportunity to tell you the Assyrian side of the story.